I'm very excited to tell you about this draft paper today because the things I discovered in writing it were new to me. Really interesting. I hope they will be to you too. The title is Special International Zones in Practice and Theory. And normally you hear in theory and practice. But in fact, this is an area where I went out and discovered this going on in the field and discovered there hasn't been a lot of theoretical discussion about it. That's what we're here to do today. So I'm going to talk about the practice, the theory, and also the development, sort of how you might use the ideas here. Once you've abstracted from what you observe in the field and come up with some general ideas, you can start applying that in other areas, a little bit like the study of physics. Once you get the laws of physics, you can start designing new machines. So I'll indulge in a little bit of that at the end. Let's start, though, with what's going on in the world today. I'll tell you a story from the headlines. In 1992, in Paris, at the Aéroport Roissy Charles de Gaulle, they had a problem. People were flying into France, people without proper documentation from the developing world who would love to settle in France or the EU and get jobs. They were flying into the airport, and they didn't have anywhere to go. It was a one-way ticket that these people had, several of them, and they show up at the airport and say, hey, we're here seeking asylum. Now, France, like most of the developed countries, many of the countries in the world, has signed the Refugee Convention. And if a refugee shows up and you've signed this Refugee Convention, you have to at least give them a hearing. And often you have to give them shelter. But what France had found was sometimes people would show up in France and seek asylum, and they would, they'd say, well, this will take us a while to process. You say, if you go back home, you'll be prosecuted, you'll be killed perhaps? Yes, okay, we'll process your application. And then they'd disappear. And so they had all these undocumented, does it sound familiar? EU has this problem too, undocumented immigrants wandering around, and for various reasons, as the United States has created problems. So France said, you're here at our airport, we don't want to start treating you like an asylum seeker, so what are we going to do? France came up with a very clever solution. They said, you're not actually in France yet. What do you mean? I'm at the airport, I'm at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Well, you're not in the territory of France yet for purposes of seeking asylum. And so this meant France could very quickly process the claim, oh, you look like an economic migrant to us, get on the plane, get out of here. Well, I'm seeking asylum. No, you're not in France yet. You don't get to do that until you're in France. And you're not in France yet. I'll explain more about this. Your jaw might be dropping. Could France do this? They not only did it, they set the precedent. Now, lots of countries do this. So here's how we normally think about nation states. The reason this might puzzle you is you think you're either inside the nation state or you're outside. That's the normal picture. You look at a map, it's like a coloring book, there's big, fat, solid lines around every country. That's not really the way the world is. And let me show you why. Some of you flew in, perhaps from outside of the country, or you know how it works in international airports. I'm going to tell a story. Let's imagine you're leaving the United States. You're going to leave from inside the United States and go to, you're just going to leave the country. That's all I need to say. So you start out at the airport. This is, I don't know if you can see the picture. It's just kind of a generic picture from Wikipedia of security. There's actually a flag in that picture, if you can see it. It's way up in the background there. The United States flag, you're still in the United States for all purposes. And then you go through security and you enter this special area, the duty-free zone. The duty-free zone. And this already, you haven't even really left the United States. Your plane is not taken off, but you're now in a special place in the United States. In this duty-free zone, you can purchase luxury goods, cigarettes, perfume, alcohol, as long as you promise to take it straight out of the country. And this allows the United States to say, normally when people in the United States consume these luxury goods, we make them pay pretty steep customs and duties. They're luxury goods, we tax them when they come into the United States. But we're going to say these goods didn't actually come into the United States yet. The chocolate came straight from France, it went to the airport, so when you buy it and you leave and you go to Singapore, you don't have to pay customs and duties because it never came into the United States. So where is the border of the United States in that story? Just think about that. All right, you go through customs, you take off. Now you think you're outside of the United States, and you pretty much are by most accounts. Let's talk about when you land in another place and you want to go into the country. What's it look like there? You touch down, let's say you're going to Tokyo, you're going to Japan. You touch down on the ground. Are you in Japan yet? Not really. You step off the plane, but you've not gone through immigration yet. You're like those asylum seekers at the Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. Japan has not yet said you get to stay. They want to look at your passport. Sometimes they want to make sure you don't have a disease. They want to maybe put you through quarantine. So you have to go through immigration, and they look at your passport and other things, and maybe they let you in and maybe they don't. Are you in Japan yet? It turns out the border is fuzzy. Let's keep going. You make it through that part of the airport, you're not done yet. You have to go through customs. And here you have to declare things. Like if you're bringing in for sale fancy perfumes, you're going to have to pay customs on that. You might have some contraband goods, maybe something you brought from a farm and it hasn't been sterilized and they're worried about getting pests in Japan, so they make you throw that away. Then finally, you make it through immigration and customs and duties, and this is the outside of arrivals. And there's somebody waiting for you. You hopefully will have somebody to give you a ride, and you're finally in Japan. So let's go back and think about this. At no point really could you say there was a clear fat line, I stepped over it, and I entered the country. It's questions of degree. And these areas where there's shades of sovereignty, I call special international zones. And I came up with this definition myself because I didn't see anybody else talking about this whole genus of institutions. So here's the definition. It's an area that its host nation state places outside of its territory for the purpose of some local law. It's like, well, here we don't require you to have yet an immigration stamp, and here you don't have to pay duties, leaving other such laws and applicable international obligations in force. So in the duty-free area at the zone at the airport, can you start shooting up heroin? No. United States law, the anti-drug laws continue especially to apply at the airport, but these other laws don't. And note that international obligations, at least in this theoretical, perhaps too neat definition, remain in place. So France got in trouble because in Amer versus France and other cases, it was alleged, France, you are bound by international law to treat these refugees in certain ways. And you're violating that. You're holding people in detention indefinitely. You're not letting them see attorneys or other legal advisors. Stop that, France. And the European Court of Human Rights kind of slapped France on the hand for that, and France said, sorry, excuse us, and we'll change it. And they changed that little thing. Now they're limited, I think it's 21 days in detention, and they have to let you seek a legal advisor. But they're still doing this. They're still having these international zones. So let's go back and look at our drawing. It's not inside and outside the nation state. You have these SIZs of various sorts that are sitting in between nation states. Now here's where it gets interesting. And by the way, I got to tell you, the reason I got into this area of law is I was working with a client who had a problem with French law. They wanted to create a special economic zone where talented workers from abroad could immediately fly in and start writing programs or engaging in business, whatever they wanted to do, without going through all the hassles of French immigration and work permits. And it's really not easy to deal with French law. They don't like strangers coming into the country and making money for obvious reasons. The same reasons that here people don't like immigrants of various types. You can say what you want to about that. We could have a long talk about that. Let's just face it, that is the way politics works, here and in France. So France was not happy about these people coming in, so they created these zones, and I wanted to say, well, can we do that? Can we just create one of these zones? Now I don't have to go to the National Assembly in France and have them change their immigration laws. We'll just say it's right next to the airport. It sounds crazy. It's not. The French came up with this idea. They created these zones, and look at how it changed. It turns out when you create one of these zones, you can do it by administrative fiat. Instead of going to the National Assembly, if you go this route, this is why it excited me as an attorney trying to help my client, it's just an administrative agency. You say, hey, can we have one of these zones? Maybe. Can we have another at a hotel at the edge? Oh, bien sûr. It's really easy. And so you can change the shape of it, but wait, it gets crazier. You can also create little zones that are not attached to the SIZ. So at Paris de Gaulle Airport, they had the SIZ. They added a hotel to it when these immigrants started piling up. They're hanging around. You can't leave them sleeping on couches in the terminal. So they had actually a hotel on the grounds, and they said, we're going to include that. You're going to go over to this hotel over there. Don't leave the grounds. It's actually kind of under lock and key. You're still not in France, officially, even though it's not attached to that little space between when you exit the airplane and go through immigration. They said, we're going to create a little bubble over here. And the longer people stayed, the more problems they had with this. People started getting pregnant or sick, and they needed to go to the hospital. Now, the hospital is not even on the airport grounds. But France says, Oh, over there at the hospital, we're going to designate this floor or those rooms as also part of the special international zone, or as they call it, a zone détente, a waiting zone. And of course, to get there, so you can create these zones all over. There, I put another one. You can create these zones all over the country, and France has done this. There are now these little pockets of France that are outside of France, all over France. And how are you going to get people from the airport to the hospital? They've created what they call floating zones. So you get in the van, and they say, get in the van, we're taking you to the hospital. This van is a special international zone. It's a floating zone is what they call it, and it floats you over to the hospital, and then you're in a temporary zone at the hospital until they get you healed or fixed or you have your kid, and then they send you back to the airport. This is all what France did. I'm just, telling you what they've done. Remarkable when you think about it. Now, this is what has happened at Roissy Charles de Gaulle, and as I said, not everybody's happy about this. A lot of what I talk about with special jurisdictions, I'm super excited. I think it can change the world. A lot of people, for good reasons, have convinced me there's some things here that are not good. Things that France is doing are not so good. Particularly, this is a picture, I don't know if you see it. It's very sad. A lot of children, meaning under the age of 18. They're not swaddling babes. But, legally speaking, children are showing up. Their parents can't take care of them. Maybe they don't have parents. And they try to get work and a home in France, and they end up being treated kind of badly by immigration officials in France. And that's kind of sad. So I've started telling you about the practice. I've only talked about duty-free zones and these zones détente, and we'll talk about some more examples. There's all types of these special international zones. I feel like a little bit like a biologist, and you land in the Galapagos Islands, and you put on your pith helmet, and you walk out to kind of see what's going on, and I feel like I discovered this whole genus of animals, and so I take delight in this. I like to go out and make lists. So let's look at some of the weird animals that I have found under the heading of special international zones. So we actually talked about this one. I didn't use the term, but they're called international transit zones. And these are the areas that every one of us who's traveled internationally has been in. And that's what they call that area when you step off the plane and you're not really in the country that you landed in yet, because you've not gone through immigration and customs. And indeed, you might not want to stay in that country. You land in Dusseldorf from New York just so you can get on a plane and take it to Rome. It's just a connecting flight. Now, strictly speaking, it seems like German officials should have to say, yeah, you can stay here for, 2 hours. You're in our country for 2 hours. You have to go through immigration. You have to go through customs. Nobody wants to do that. The Germans don't want to do it. So everybody basically says, all the civilized countries say, if you just stay in this part of the airport, you can go to your connecting flight, and we'll kind of pretend you were never in Germany. Now, if you murder somebody, you're going to be in trouble under German law. But, forget the customs, and it's just for a little bit. You're just passing through. That's an international transit zone. And this, by the way, shows SIZ, special international zones, really at their best. Because I think in a perfect world, they can be great tools for liberalism, by which I mean the pursuit of liberty. International law is, insofar as it has principles, is really about freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and freedom of cultural exchange. That's the beauty of the international world. It allows us to get out of our little parochial countries and meet the world and trade with the world and learn about the world. And these international transit zones make that very easy. So yay for that kind of SIZ. That is really advancing liberal international values in the best way. Duty-free retail areas, these are really, legally speaking, not quite so interesting. I can read from U.S. law. In U.S. law, here's really what they call these. They call this, it's defined by both area and party. It's kind of interesting. But they say a duty-free retailer is, I'm quoting the code here, the federal code, a person that sells for use outside of the customs territory duty-free merchandise that is delivered from a bonded warehouse. Dr. Moberg talked about these warehouses. They're outside of U.S. law for purposes of customs and duties. Outside the customs territory, duty-free merchandise is delivered from a bonded warehouse to an airport or other exit point for exportation by or on behalf of individuals departing from the customs territory. So I just want to show you, part of federal law, it's defined both by the type of good, where it is, the bonded warehouse, it never really gets into the country officially, and the fact it's going into the hands of someone who's leaving again. So duty-free areas, Not the biggest part of the economy, but you get nice cheese and wine, and we're all for that. Now, these pre-asylum waiting areas, I'll return to these. I hit these a lot because they're the ones that have been in the news. It's only one type of SIZ, but the one in France got a lot of attention from human rights workers and activists for good reason, but it also got attention from other countries who said, that's a great idea. We have the same problem, France. We're going to do it too. And so now there's this long list of things. What do they call them? I have the list here. They're called, France calls them zones détente, but other countries have made them into migration zones, excised territories, reception areas, transit areas, detention areas. A lot of countries have these now. They're all over the world. They get different names. The United States does it too. Here's what the United States does. They get these people on the open ocean. Coast Guard goes out there and finds a bunch of Haitians trying to escape, I'm not going to say bad things about their country, but their government is not serving them well. So they try to go to America for more opportunities. They're not asylums. They can't claim if they go back home someone's going to kill them. They'll go back home and they won't get a job and they might get sick and die. That's not enough to become an asylum under international law. So the Coast Guard picks them up, and now the Coast Guard has a problem. Because arguably, as soon as they get on that Coast Guard boat, they are in America for purposes of seeking asylum. And so they get on the boat, they started doing this. I'm seeking asylum. And then the Coast Guard kind of rolls their eyes and says, okay, well, we got to process this person. It's going to take a while. So, all right, we're going to take you back to Miami, and we got to have a detention center for you. And you might, if we're a little lax, you might make it out into the streets, and we'll probably never see you again. And this makes the Coast Guard unhappy. And frankly, most of these people probably do not qualify for asylum under the International Asylum Convention. They're just economic migrants. I don't know if I should say just, but that's what they are. So the Coast Guard figures most of these people are going to get sent out again. So they set aside part of the deck of the ship, and they say, that part of the ship deck is not part of America. You think you're in America because you see the U.S. flag on the flagpole of this vessel? Not that part of the deck. Everybody, stay there. And of course, I guess if they have to go to the head, they say, well, you're a floating zone. You're not really in America yet. Does it seem absurd? It is kind of absurd. But other countries love this. Australia has said whole parts of our country, whole islands, are not part of Australia. So they can pick up these people, dump them on the island, put them there for a while, not worry about them being in Australia for asylum purposes. And it gets so bad. You can say in France, I say so bad, maybe I shouldn't say that, but it goes this far in France. They say to some people, all right, we're going to let you out of this detention facility. You have to go over to Nîmes to go to a hearing, an asylum hearing. You're never stepping in France the whole way. Oh, am I going to be in one of those vans? No. Here's your ticket. Get on the train. You're in a floating zone for yourself. You're like a single person in your own zone. I know I feel like that sometimes, but this is legally. Legally, they're in their own zone, wandering about the country. Now, we're all laughing, but let's stop and think about this for a second. Where you could end up here is basically a whole population of people wandering around your country, totally indistinguishable from anybody else. They don't have a flag on their head. They look like you and me. In France, they might have different colored skin or whatever. But, they're people just like you and me. They're in a different legal regime. They look like you and me. I'm not sure that's the kind of world we're used to, the kind of world we want, where the people on the street, you can kind of walk down the street and go, you have more rights than you. You're officially here, and you're just kind of visiting. Think about that. The French have put us there, and other countries are really ready to follow them down that road. A little worrying. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The next category of SIZs are special economic zones, export processing zones, foreign trade zones, free trade zones. The list goes on. And basically, I talk about these in my book. So read the book, Your Next Government. It is out already. It's available now. I have copies around. So let's talk about some other stuff, though. Other ones. These are fun ones. As I started looking around, I discovered, man, there's a ton of these SIZs. CERN. This is I forget what that stands for. It's a French acronym, but you've heard about CERN, the superconducting super collider. It costs about $4 billion to build. A lot of European countries got together to fund it and run it, and it actually straddles a national border. It goes between Switzerland and France. So the whole structure is so big it crosses over international borders. So the people working there are outside of the scope of the national laws of the countries in which they're working for many purposes. They don't pay income taxes locally. So you're a CERN scientist and you're working on their Swiss side of the border on their plant and in their labs. You're not paying local income taxes. You're not paying local Social Security. You have to make kind of contributions. CERN has its own kind of Social Security fund. You have to contribute to this internal fund, which I guess takes care of you when you retire. You're not in the country for purposes of having your papers and effects and your lab looked at by local officials. If they come up and say, well, what's going on in there? We want to serve papers on somebody, or we think you have maybe armaments in there. We're going to investigate CERN grounds. And you say, no, you're not. Because we are inviolate under international law. And they just show your hand to the Swiss, or if you're in France, the French officials, wherever you are, and they got to turn around and walk the other way. And when I thought about this more, I realized it's a lot like how the church was treated in the Middle Ages. I don't mean to disparage at all what the good scientists of CERN are doing. I don't mean to disparage what the clerics in the Middle Ages were doing at their churches. But I will say it really smells like the same thing. It's maybe a good thing, but it's amusing to make the parallel. Most of us don't understand what's going on at CERN. These people in their ceremonial robes go around and they do incantations and magic stuff happens. And basically these countries have stood back and said, with regard to this kind of new religion, we respect that so much, we're going to protect you. You are inviolate. You're outside of our borders. Another one here, Hong Kong and Macau. We've already talked about that. Lotta mentioned that, and I think John, too, alluded to those. And basically, those are parts of China, but for many purposes, immigration, labor code, taxes, they're kind of outside of China for purposes of those laws. United Nations is like CERN, and my favorite one is the curious case of Princess Margriet of the Netherlands. So it's 1940. The whole royalty of the Netherlands is in exile because the Germans are camped out there. So they go to exile and they're living in Canada. And Prince Margriet, this is in her full blossom as an adult. At the time, she was being born. And there's this curious bit of aristocratic law in the Netherlands where if she had been born on foreign soil, it would put a cloud on her claim to the throne. So basically they said to the Canadian government, do you think maybe you could call this part of the hospital not part of Canada during this birth? And they said yes. And it was in Ottawa, and this is actually in Ottawa. She went back to visit because she has a soft spot in her heart for the kind people of Ottawa who kind of didn't give her a home when she was being born. They said, you're being born somewhere else, so she become a princess, I guess. Fun little example. All right, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to tell you about the theory. Some people have looked at this and said, this is ridiculous. It's fictional, it's illegal, it's illiberal. And I want to say it's not fictional, it's happening. It's not illegal. I could read you laws till the end of the day, how governments have said we're doing this. That it's illiberal, I think, is a good point. We need to think about what kind of world we want to live in. And again, by liberal, I don't mean left-wing. I mean the kind of stuff, right-wing or left-wing, in the civilized world, I think you sign on to. It's that people should be free to travel. We should be equal under the law. We should be able to exchange culturally with other people. We should be engaged in trade with other nations. I would say free trade, but at least with few restrictions. SIZs can help or hurt those liberal international goals. I think we need to watch them. We need to develop this theory. I'm going to be watching them. And I'd like for them to become liberal international refuges, places where people can go when the nation state is not very liberal, where they can get protection. The problem with what France has done is they've pulled back the freedoms of the state and left the powers in place. It's pure police power in these zones. There's no rights for those people. They should be doing the reverse. They should pull back on the police powers, as they do in these international transit zones, and let people free. You can do it either way, and I think we should keep an eye on that. All right, so that's the theory. Quickly, I'm going to say this gives me some ideas of how I can help clients of the world. I'm actually not going to say much at all about refugee cities, except to say Michael has not signed on to any of this, okay? I talked with him about this. He's been kind of non-committal. It's interesting. He might not talk about this just because I used the awesome slide from his awesome website. Don't blame him for anything you don't like. But I do think these SIZs could help the kind of project Michael and others are working on, because it could give refugees a way to find a comfortable place to stay. Like Syrian refugees could stay in Lebanon and even work there, but they wouldn't have to go through immigration and residency. We'd say you're in a special zone. And these people wouldn't just be sitting around camps twiddling their thumbs, going stir crazy. They could be productive. But the people in Lebanon who are hosting them very kindly wouldn't have to worry that they're now doubling the size of their population with all these people who don't really share their values, who are going to be able to vote if they stay another year and seek asylum. That's worrisome to the Lebanese, which means they don't want to help these people. We need to find a middle ground, and SIZs might be able to help us do that. Also, I learned in helping some clients with this area, there's a whole industry out there. This is a website from one of the leading firms. All they do is they help high net worth individuals figure out where they want to live. Because there's lots of countries now basically buying and they're selling residency and work permits to the highest bidder. You may sneer at that, but I'm telling you, a lot of countries do it. I think it can be a good thing. It puts money in the pockets of countries that need it. It helps people who can afford it, at least, have more liberty to travel. And it's always the rich who go first. They afford the attorneys to set it up, and eventually it comes to us. And someday I hope all of us will get the benefits these rich people are getting, so we can say, you know, I'd love to go work in Greece for a while. I have some skills they need there, but man, Greece does not like people to come in and work because they worry about stealing jobs from the locals. It'd be great if you had a special international zone in Greece where you could go and work and not be counted in the country. Maybe even stay, maybe even get some kind of special citizenship. I want countries to be flexible here so they can offer us options. All right, I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up and say, what have we talked about at SIZs? I told you about the practice, for better or worse, the theory, which I think could make it better, and some ways that we could maybe use these ideas in the future. I'm going to stop there, and I'll hand it over to Michael. Thank you.